a special guest who's just written a book. The United States is on the road to becoming a fascist society, right under our very noses. That's the premise of the new book by feminist social critic Naomi Wolf. It's called The End of America, Letter of Warning to a Young Patriot. And it's already on the New York Times bestseller list. Naomi Wolf outlines what she sees as the 10 steps to shut down a democratic society. She argues the Bush administration has already implemented many of these steps. Naomi Wolf is the author of several books, including the 90s feminist classic, The Beauty Myth. Critics describe her latest book, The End of America, as a wake-up call to Americans to heed the lessons of history and fight to save their democracy before it's too late. Naomi Wolf joins us in our Firehouse studio. Welcome to Democracy Now!
Thank you, Amy.
It's good to have you with us. Start off with the stories that you tell in your book.
Well, they're the stories of societies that were systematically closed down by would-be despots, would-be dictators, whether they were on the left or the right, who essentially developed a blueprint in the first part of the 20th century to crush democracies or to crush democracy movements. So there are also individual stories of how people react as a democracy is being closed down. But I guess the book really began with a very personal story because I was forced to write it, even though I didn't really want to, by a dear friend who is a Holocaust survivor's daughter. And when we spoke about news events, she kept saying, they did this in Germany, they did this in Germany, and I really didn't think that made sense. I thought that was very extreme language. But finally she forced me to sit down and start reading the histories, of course, not of the later years, because she wasn't talking about German outcomes, 38, 39. She was talking about the early years, 1930, 31, 32, when Germany was a parliamentary democracy, and there was this systematic assault using the rule of law to subvert the rule of law. And once I saw how many parallels there were, not just in strategy and tactics, but that we're seeing again today, but actually in images and sound bites and language, then I read other histories of Italy in the 20s, Russia in the 30s, East Germany in the 50s, Czechoslovakia in the 60s, Pinochet's coup in Chile in 73, the crushing of the democracy movement in China at the end of the 80s. And I saw that there is a blueprint that would-be dictators always do the same 10 things, whether they're on the left or the right, and that we are seeing these 10 steps taking place systematically right now in the United States.
Lay them out.
Well, they're not happy. The first step is that all would-be dictators or would-be despots, which is what the founders of our country who foresaw exactly this kind of possibility would call them, all would-be dictators invoke a terrifying internal and external threat. And often it's a real threat, which they will hyper-manipulate. For instance, Stalin spoke about sleeper cells, which is one of those phrases that are being sort of recirculated now by the Bush White House. And this was an invention. He said there were capitalist secret agents who were hiding among good Soviet citizens and who were going to rise up at a signal and create terrorist mayhem. Fake story, but it worked to frighten citizens. Pinochet talked about a real threat, armed insurgents. There were armed insurgents, but he hyped it using fake documents, and we see this a lot in the historical blueprint, that a would-be dictator will fake documents. His were called Plan Z. He claimed they were going to bomb infrastructure, assassinate leaders. We saw fake documents used by the White House to hype a terror threat when they used the fake yellow cake documents to claim that Iraq was trying to secure yellow cake uranium. And remember the famous soundbite, "We can't wait for the smoking gun to come in the form of a mushroom cloud," to drive us into an illegal war with a nation we were not at war with.
You also talk about the language, like the Department of Homeland Security.
That is where I, as a social critic and a student of language, get really scared. It's scary enough to see these 10 steps, but what is terrifying to me personally is how many actual phrases are being recycled. And tactics. Homeland Security, Heimat, became popularized by the National Socialists. Goebbels developed the practice of embedding journalists. Leigh von Riefenstahl was embedded, for instance, in Poland, and we're seeing
She's the famous German filmmaker.
If you look at the sequence of Hitler descending in an airplane and von Riefenstahl's famous triumph of the will and being greeted by the uniformly armed paramilitary sort of surrounding their leader, and him saying, help us accomplish our mission. And then you look at other famous images from this administration.
Like George Bush on
Mission accomplished. Exactly right. You look at how, Hitler said we have to invade Czechoslovakia because they're a staging ground for terrorists, and they're abusing their ethnic minorities. Again, a country they were not at war with. When the WMD charge vanished, the White House said we have to invade Iraq because they're a staging ground for terrorists, and they're abusing their ethnic minorities, on and on and on. I mean, this one scares me to death. You know, the Mussolini developed, again, a parliamentary democracy. Italy was in the teens and into 1920. He developed the black shirts, which were these paramilitary thugs that beat up newspaper editors, terrorized the population, and they intimidated people counting the vote in Milan. And then Hitler studied Mussolini, so many things were repeated by Hitler. Stalin studied Hitler, Hitler studied Stalin. But Hitler developed the brown shirts, the SA, who intimidated people counting the vote in Austria. So 90% of them voted for their own annexation because there were the brown shirts. And you saw this scene of identically dressed Republican staffers in Florida in 2000, intimidating people counting the vote. So things like that are really chilling. And they're more and more chilling as I think right now people are kind of ramping up their awareness of these echoes. And what you also see predictively, because the blueprint is predictive, is that the White House is ramping up its implementation of some of the scariest aspects of this crackdown.
You began with these stories back in the summer of 2006 of headlines from a 2-week period. Give some of those examples.
Well, 2006 seems so long ago and so innocent a time, considering how swiftly we've zoomed along implementing this blueprint, or we're suffering this implementation. In 2006, a blogger was jailed in San Francisco. In 2006, people in Alabama couldn't get a fair hearing for protecting voter rolls. There was the beginning of the Military Commissions Act of 2006, in which the state basically legalized torture, which is one of these crucial turning points as an open society closes down.
You talk about Christine Axsmith, the computer security expert working for the CIA, who posted a message on a blog site on a top secret computer network criticizing waterboarding, saying waterboarding is torture and torture is wrong.
And then she lost her security clearance. She's one of many, many whistleblowers, key individuals who have tried to take a stand against some of these positions and who have faced, again, in a closing society, this is what happens. This is step 7, target key individuals. They faced job loss, character assassination, or worse. Valerie Plame's bolts were taken away from her back deck, 50 feet off the ground. She has 2 toddlers. People are being put on the watch list for criticizing the government, for engaging in anti-war protest. Their kids are being put on the watch list. But yeah, back then, all she said was, it's wrong. And now we've just confirmed an attorney general who pretends not to know what waterboarding is, because if he acknowledged that it's against U.S. and international law, he'd be confirming the fact that there are criminals in the White House right now who have already stated.
You say step 3 is establishing secret prisons.
That's right. You establish secret prisons, and what I mean by that is unaccountable prisons where torture takes place. And often there will be a military tribunal system set in place. Lenin pioneered that. Mussolini developed the Confino system. Hitler, again, studied Mussolini and developed the People's Court. And what starts to happen is, and this is what's so scary about Guantanamo and Abu Ghraib and these black sites around the world, apart from the moral issue, and your interview just now with the Palestinian representative brought me to tears, because when he said it's not just the Palestinians he's concerned about, it's the Israelis who lose their souls by this kind of occupation. It's not just the often innocent prisoners in Guantanamo and Abu Ghraib and these black sites around the world we should be concerned about. It's our own American souls that are at stake. But just for purely personal reasons we should be afraid when the state starts to torture people that it sees as at the margins, or that citizens see at the margins. Brown people on an island in Guantanamo with Muslim names, whatever. That's what they did in Germany in 31, 32. Anarchists, communists, gypsies, Jews, whatever, homosexuals, whatever. You know, people didn't care because they were seen as at the margins. People knew about the torture cellars in Germany. But then what always happens, always, you can't name a society in which this doesn't happen, Amy, is that there's a blurring of the line. And once the state legalizes torture of people at the margins, inevitably it will begin to direct state abuse at people at the heart of civil society, and it's always the same cast of characters: journalists, editors, opposition leaders, outspoken clergy, and labor leaders. And when that starts to happen, society can close down in a heartbeat because people start to censor themselves.
It's interesting. During the lead up to Nazi Germany, American reporters were fired by their American editors, pulled back from Germany because they were sounding the warning. They were saying, we're seeing a fascist society build. And they were told that they were biased. They were not understanding the circumstances in which Hitler was rising up. People were concerned about their economy. They had been devastated, and that they were being alarmist.
Interesting. That's really interesting. I mean, I'm immediately thinking, as you say that, which I actually hadn't known, that I'm thinking of a lot of books I've been reading lately about deep U.S. involvement. Some corporations were deeply involved in Nazi Germany, making millions, like IBM. How did they round people up so quickly? You know, in Germany, when they were rounding up the Jews so fast, it's because IBM had developed this prototype of a punch card system, and they were secretly working with the Nazis. Prescott Bush, Bush's grandfather, was making millions in consolidation with Krupps, the Thyssen, and it's very interesting to me because in the Nuremberg trials, they went after these industrialists like Krupps. And so there was a moment at which the Nuremberg trial was about to identify supporters of these war crimes who were U.S. collaborators.
But they didn't.
But they didn't. But I think it's interesting that there is that historical memory in the family.
It's the question of who controlled the trials. Right. It's the question of who controlled the trials and not wanting their own people to...
I see.
Be involved. You talk in 4, developing a paramilitary force and surveilling ordinary citizens.
Yeah, that's another big one. I just want to note about the blurring of the line, why we're in such a moment of danger right now. The president has said that he can say, Amy Goodman, you're an enemy combatant. Naomi Wolf, you're an enemy combatant. This guy behind the camera, you're an enemy combatant. Person walking down the street, enemy combatant. And it doesn't matter that we're innocent U.S. citizens. I mean, we could be Republicans, we could be evangelicals, doesn't matter. He can take us, and if he says it's true, that makes it true because it's a status offense, and he can put us in a 10 by 12-foot cell in a Navy brig in solitary confinement for 3 years, making it difficult for us to see our families, to contact an attorney, to get charges filed. They can't torture us yet, though I was chilled to learn that an advisor to the White House was reported in a British newspaper yesterday as not ruling out waterboarding against U.S. citizens. However, psychiatrists know that prolonged isolation makes sane people insane. That's what happened to Jose Padilla. So, you know, when I say everyone's got their moment at which they start to silence themselves, the day I read in the New York Times that someone I identify with has been named an enemy combatant and is sitting in a Navy brig in isolation, that's when I'm going to stop talking in a context like this, because that's when I will become too afraid.
We're talking to Naomi Wolf. Her book is The End of America, a letter of warning to a young patriot. Number 6 in these 10 steps toward fascism. Infiltrate citizen groups. 7, arbitrarily detain and release citizens. 8, target key individuals. Infiltrate citizens groups, the evidence.
Well, the ACLU is suing many agents of the state for illegally infiltrating citizens groups. It's not a new thing in the United States. COINTELPRO did it quite a lot. But it is a hallmark. It's an extension of surveillance society, and it's a hallmark. It's an extension of step number 4, which was the surveillance apparatus. Now, you can't close down a democracy without a surveillance apparatus aimed at ordinary citizens. And what many of us know is that there's been a heightening of surveillance in the wake of 9/11. But what we've got to understand is that our country is unique right now in directing the crackdown on civil liberties and surveillance at citizens. Countries like England and Spain experience the same terror attacks, the same kind of terror attacks by the same bad guys that we did, but they're not using that as a pretext to strip citizens of civil liberties in the same way. And what is so terrifying, again, Italy had a surveillance apparatus. People were informing on each other. Germany, surveillance, the Stasi in East Germany. You couldn't have a conversation with your neighbor without fearing that it was going to go into your file. You can't close down a society without a paramilitary force. We skipped over that one. That's very important. Blackwater, the black shirts, the brown shirts, that's not answerable to the people, and surveillance. So why am I petrified? Why, when I read about Blackwater and about surveillance, I was on the watch list for 1.5 years, Amy, which means that every time I got on a plane, I got taken aside for extra searching, quadruple S, high risk, Naomi, and I was told you're on the list. And I found out that many critics of the administration are on the list. UCLA, ACLU, staffers, Ted Kennedy, anti-war activists, David Altoon, a highly decorated Vietnam War veteran who was critical of the Iraq War. Not only is he on the list, but people who come to me in tears after my readings are more upset that now their kids are on the list if they write a letter critical of the Bush administration.
Have you been able to get off the list?
Well, I was off the list till this book came out, and now I'm back on the list. Why is this more than a sort of irritation, or in a strong society it's just like whatever, this is kind of a compliment, but in a closing society it gets very frightening. In February, the management of the lists, which have swollen from 45,000 to 775,000 Americans, they're adding 20,000 names a month, right? Where are they getting those names? Remember when I said, how do they round up people so quickly in a closing society? The management of the lists is going to go from the airlines to the government. And in February, unless we push back this regulation, it's being slipped in very quietly. We are going to have to apply to the state to get an airline ticket to cross the border, which moves us from 1931 to about 1936.
Number 9 and number 10 of your steps toward fascism. Restrict the press, cast criticism as espionage, dissent as treason, subvert the rule of law is 11. What is the Patriots' task, where you conclude?
Well, the Patriots' task is first to wake up. I mean, all around the world, democracy activists who are familiar with these same 10 steps are sort of waving their arms at us, going, no, recognize this. You don't make it easier for the president to declare martial law, as we just did with the 2007 Defense Authorization Act. You don't make it easier for the president to lock up political opponents in a cell or strip people of habeas corpus. No, you don't make it easier for the president to have a paramilitary force like Blackwater, composed of hand-selected torturers and murderers from countries like Chile and Nigeria and El Salvador, where they're trained to torture their own civilians. You don't set them loose in Illinois and Southern California and North Carolina. No, bad idea. So first you wake up, you see the blueprint.
Seconds.
Finally, we've started the AmericanFreedomCampaign.org. It's a democracy movement to restore the rule of law. We're calling for lawyers across the country and citizens to call for hearings, special prosecutor, identify the crimes, impeach and prosecute, and save the country.
Naomi Wolf, I want to thank you for being with us. Do you think Democratic candidates are raising these issues for president?
Not enough. This is a transpartisan issue, and we all need to push them, hold their feet to the fire.
Naomi Wolf's book is The End of America. Thank you for being with us.